Hello everybody and welcome back to Big Dan's channel. I am, of course, as always, Big Dan, and today I'm doing something similar to what I did last year, if you watched back then, which is my 2024 ranked for cinema. So for this list, I'm going to be ranking all of the different films that I watched either at the cinema this year or at home at a later date that had a UK release date and it had at least some kind of theatrical release within cinemas. It's basically just based on my personal opinion. It doesn't always matter too much about how well made something is, though that is something that's also kind of taken into account a little bit, but enjoyment is the priority here when I made this list. So we're going to be going through all the different films, there's 35 in total, starting from worst to best. And yeah, I hope you enjoy it. As I said, I did something similar last year, so if you want to watch that, I'll link that in the description. And yeah, let's crack on. Okay, so landing in place number 35, dead last in the list, and in my opinion, frankly, the worst film of the year, is My Old Ass. Now, I know a lot of people like this one, but to be honest, my only redeeming quality for this was Aubrey Plaza. For a 90-minute film, it just felt like it dragged on way too long. It had a really not approaching. It had a really insulting approach to lesbianism, and frankly, as I said, Aubrey Plaza was the only thing I liked about this, and it was even misleading in its marketing because she's barely in the film at all. She has about 15 minutes screen time, if that. And as well as that, I just really didn't like practically any of the characters here. I don't think there was a single one I liked except Aubrey Plaza. Yeah, it was just really bad. And if you think I'm being sexist here or something by putting the one that's about a woman dead last, well, I mean, I watched this with Delia as well, and she gave it the exact same rating I did, so I'm not. Okay. Next up at number 34, we have Madam Web. Now, with this one, I knew this was a bad film. Again, this is another one I watched at home. Delia actually quite liked this the first time she watched it, but when she rewatched it with me, and obviously this has been the only time I watched it, she dragged her rating down from about 3.5 stars to 2, and I gave it 1.5 stars as well. It had some alright performances, and the music is also okay. Like, but again, those things are just all right. There's nothing really here that I would say was good or above average at least. The dubbing for the villain here is atrocious. It's got little action, and as everyone says, the costume design is awful. And it has to be, as I said, the worst film dubbing I've ever seen in film history. Yeah, it was just not very good, and even some of the camera work as well. There was like random zooms in during conversations, and it just didn't look very good, and it was just a bit horrendous. Yeah, should deserve better. Is all I'm going to say. But yeah, I'm not going to waste time on explaining my reasons for this one anymore. You'll probably already know all of them. Next up, we'll have a film you might not have heard of too much called Night Bitch. There's some decent performances, and I like Amy Adams' performance in particular. And it does have a lot to say about motherhood, and it's honestly the best thing I had to say about the film. But for again, this is another one that had similar pacing problems. The thing's like 89 minutes long, and its pacing is absolutely horrendously slow. And it genuinely, I was literally at 20 minutes in, I looked at my watch and I thought we're near the end mark. It was that badly done. And as well as that, it's like dog storyline that the thing sort of promotes itself around and is the main focus that you go and see in it. It doesn't really feel like it has any effect on the story whatsoever, and it was just a bit weird, and I don't understand it. I'll say this, it had some decent humour here and there, but I just wasn't a massive fan of this, and I get that I'm not the target audience for it, so I will put that into account when it comes to it, but it just, at least in my opinion, and again, Delia's as well, it just wasn't the best. Yeah, I don't get it, but yeah, that's all I've got to say about it. Next up is one that probably everyone will have heard of here. It Ends With Us. Now, I didn't think this was outright bad, but to be frank, it could have been better. There's all right performances, but they do sometimes get a bit poor when me and Delia went to each other. Oh, that was a bit. And even that as well, like some of the dialogue, although I will admit it does have my favourite line of the year in the fact of the line, my mom used to splurge on the cookies at Christmas. But frankly, it has an unrealistic representation of domestic violence based just off what media and what you hear of survivors and that. Not insulting, I'd say, but it just, I don't know, it just didn't feel too realistic, shall we say. Though I do appreciate the hereditary nature it tries to get across in the same reaction to abuse, and it does have some decent pace and it doesn't particularly drag, so I can at least say that for it. But I just wasn't the biggest fan of the film, so. Next up on the list, in number 31, we have Red One. Now, I know this is a pretty bad film, and I know it's not very well made. I'll say that about it. And honestly, this thing did deserve to lose money. but I will say about it, I do find it quite unintentionally funny. Yeah, the story's generic and it's something we've all seen before, and 2 stars is about where it deserves to be. But I don't know. I thought it had some decent pace, and as Delia said when we were leaving, if we were both 6 years old, we probably would have went out banger like when we watched it. So take that into account. Like again, it's a kids' film, so I'm probably not going to enjoy it as much as the rest. I will say though, there is a kids' film at the top of this list, or near the top of this list, that I actually did quite enjoy. We'll get back to that later. Next up on the list is a pretty indie film, to be honest. It's one called Time Stalker. There's some nice charm and humour here on top of some of the nice design for its time periods, which I did actually quite like. And it does actually, to my surprise, it really had some solid gore, and it genuinely shocked both me and Dina when I watched this. So I will say that for the film. But to be honest, it felt like a GCSE drama piece for a large amount of it, with the acting and just the general vibes it gave off. And sometimes it didn't give nearly enough time to admire certain time periods, because again they were really nice designed. I just wish we got to see more of them, because literally one of them you only see for like a minute if that, and I wish they explored more into that one especially. But I will say Nick Frost carried. I do quite like him in this film. He's always a blast. So next on the list we'll have one of the very first films I watched this year, and one of the first reviews I did for this year. I think it was even the first review this year on the channel. We have The Beekeeper. Now, it was a pretty mid-January release, as you kind of expect with a January release, to be honest. It was held together by its action and performances from Jason Statham and Josh Hutcherson in particular, but it really needed better dialogue, and as I said there, it was just a typical sort of January release as you expect from your action films. I will also say now, just while it's on my mind, from this point onwards, we're out of sort of the bad territory, and the films I'm talking about now until our next disco are kind of just the mid ones that are below the better ones from this year. Next up, we'll have Migration. Honestly, just everything about this film screams mid. It's just mid animation, mid voice acting, mid story. I have nothing really else to say about it. Just every aspect of it was pretty mediocre. I don't know what else you want from us. I remember obviously I covered this one on the channel, so I'll go a little bit more in depth there if you want a bit more in depth review, but that's about all I've got to say about it for right now. Next up, we'll have another film that kind of disappointed us, to be honest. We'll have Trap. As I say in my review, I expected this to be better. It had so much more promise that I just didn't deliver on. I still enjoyed it enough, but just, again, it could have done more with the premise it had. It was really interesting, and it was kind of good premise, wasted execution. It had a very slow third act. Like, it's not as bad as the pacing of stuff like, what do you call it? My Old Ass and films like that, which I've mentioned earlier. But the third act was just way too long, and it was to the point that it was just getting really repetitive by the end of it. And even some of the dialogue wasn't the best in the performances, but it still had some really good tension, and honestly, that was what carried the film for us. Yeah, and got the like from us. Next up, we'll have another film that was sadly mid, Blink Twice, although I did like this a bit more than some of the other ones from this year. I can really respect what this is trying to go for with its representation of women and, of course, sexual violence and all that, and its performances. And on that note, I can say that it handles it really well, like especially considering at the start of this film there's a little warning sort of thing within the film itself, saying that it handles sexual violence and those kinds of aspects of film. And I can really appreciate the film for trying to be sensitive about it. And Zoe Kravitz, I can also appreciate what she's tried to do here, as I said. But my problems with it was just the editing was a bit disjointed, and yeah, the editing was just a bit disjointed, and it felt a bit weird, and it felt like one of those kind of abstract Oscar films it was trying to go for, but it just didn't work for that. And it was like the same thing goes for the pace, and the ending just doesn't make much sense to us. Like, again, I get what this was trying to go for. I can understand why people like it a bit, but for me, it just didn't land too well. Same goes for Delia. I will say though, I do like Channing Tatum in this. His performance was really good, and he does show off some good versatility. If there was one performance in the film who definitely carried it, it has to be him. Next up, we'll have another one that I reviewed earlier this year, Bob Marley, One Love. It's the same thing I said back then if you didn't already watch it. I would have appreciated a lot more depth, but I do appreciate that the film was trying to cover a lot in one go. But again, it was because it was trying to cover so much that it never went really in depth or had too much substance in any particular subject. But it was still heartfelt, and it felt alright at least, and it was enjoyable enough as a Valentine's Day sort of film in a packed cinema. But yeah, other than that, it just wasn't the greatest, and it just sadly fell into mid territory, to be honest. Next, Joker Folie Do. Now, I know what people are going to think with us putting this high up the list. Again, I also thought this was just a mid-film at best, and honestly, as everyone else has said, completely unnecessary sequel, and the original film will always be superior to me. What can I say? Joaquin's performance, it's decent, but it's not as good as the first film. The musicals, it's a bit unnecessary, but I can say the music is at least relatively well written, I'd say, and I did enjoy the actual musical numbers themselves. And Lady Gaga, I thought, had a decent performance, but again, it just was really unnecessary, and this is a film that doesn't need to exist, even if it's all right and it's not as bad as everyone says. But yeah, if anything, I can see this is the reason why people keep saying Hollywood needs to stop making unnecessary sequels that tarnish the first one. Because I don't know if it does it for myself yet, because I haven't rewatched the first. But yeah, it doesn't need to exist. Next on the list, I have American Fiction. Now, what I liked about this is its relevance to sort of the current climate in which we live, and how it's exploring how a black lecturer or professor is having to sort of change what he writes about and sees as truth in order to fit a certain narrative. I thought that was really good, and it is a good comment on how kind of sometimes maybe pushing too much for representation in the wrong way. Don't get us wrong, I like representation and everything. I think it's an important thing to have. But when you do it in the wrong way, I can see why this was made in order to sort of push back when it like kind of goes against the effect people are going for when they're aiming for more representation. And yeah, sure, it dragged a bit, and the ending was a little bit of letdown, maybe. But again, I can respect that this is an important film I have today. I can also say that from American Fiction going upwards, and that when I went to the decent ones, that I gave at least 3.5 stars or more. So while we've made territory now went to sort of the better films of this year. Next up, we have Paddington in Peru. You can tell here that the Paul King charm has just completely gone from it. You can tell it's a whole different director and everything. It's just, as I say, like it's a whole different style and everything, and you can tell it's by different directors, I've just said. But I do think it still has a decent performance from Olivia Colman and Ben Whishaw, even if for the most part the film I thought was mid and it got pushed up because of its ending, which I thought was quite nice and heartfelt. And again, yeah, there was some charm lost, and I do miss Sally Hawkins, but this charm was still sort of there, like it wasn't completely lost. You could still kind of tell it, though I will say early on in the film there is a little bit of a cringe musical number that I had to turn to Deanna and go, please tell us there's no more of this, because it was actually her second watch of it in the cinema. But yeah, it was all right enough and it was decent. I just don't see it as being like a 4-star film like some have given, and I still prefer the first two, to be honest. Next up, we'll have Longlegs, another one that I reviewed on the channel, and my most popular review this year. There's a strong performance from Nick Cage, and it feels like a fresh coat of paint here, especially considering his versatility being shown within roles. Though I will say I don't think it's as good as everyone made out. Like, I wouldn't say this is like the scariest horror in years, because it's like, I'd say Barbarian still takes that throne for me personally. But it's still decent. You know, I had enough of an enjoyable time with it. There's still some good scares here and all that, even if it's kind of maybe a little bit misleading in its marketing around the sort of paranormal aspect, because honestly, the memes, I can see why people made them. It's stuff to laugh at, really. But yeah, honestly, it's still a decent entry. I don't think it's too bad. It's just, it could have been more, and it's not a 4-star film like some have made out. Same thing as I said with Paddington in Peru. Next on the list, we have Kinds of Kindness. One of the reviews I did earlier this year after I'd been on hiatus for a little while, and one of the first ones I did this year after I'd been on hiatus, that is. So its stories don't connect much, and it does get pretty weird at times, I will say that. But I can say I did find this really original, even if I'm not a big fan of the third story of it. And Delia found this to be pretty mid as well, but I just thought it was a nice little film, and honestly, yeah, it's decent enough, and I like the great performances here, even if, again, I know I've said this a few times now, but this is another one that I wouldn't say is 4 stars like everyone's given out. Next up at number 19 on the list, we'll have Piece by Piece. Now, this was decent, but as I said in my review, I wish they cut down on the parts where Pharrell wasn't the focus and people were going off topic, because when that happened, it did really drag quite a bit, to be honest. But it's definitely going to please his fans, me included. I am a bit of a Pharrell fan myself, I'll admit. And the Lego is a really nice change that they used well, and I don't think it just felt shoehorned in at any point. It did feel like they tried to put an actual effort into the Lego used to represent his life. so I could respect it for being different at least. Next up, I have the last review I have for the year, The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim. Now, this is one, if it'll probably be fresh in your minds, but in case you didn't watch that video, it has some relatively solid pacing, well, at least until the last half hour. And it is, honestly, in my opinion, a good entry in the Middle-earth franchise, because I like how it explores sort of pre-War of the Ring. Again, I've not seen The Rings of Power, so I can't really talk about how it compares and whether that's a good entry pre-War of the Ring. But yeah, it just yeah, it doesn't need to exist. You can make that argument about it, and it's definitely not as good as the original trilogy. And I still don't really like the anime. Well, not dislike it, but I still don't know how I feel about the anime style too much. But yeah, what can I say? I did like the design of the anime at least. I had a fun enough time with it. It satisfied the Middle Earth fan within us. You know, what else can I say really? It was just a fun little film. Landing at number 17, we'll have Smile 2. This was a decent standalone sequel to the first film. The only problem that I really had with it that really let it down was its last act plot twist. It was well done and it was cleverly done and all that, but it does make us go, oh, so I've just basically been, watching something for no reason sort of thing. And it does leave maybe a few little questions here and there. But still, it was a good display of sort of scaling up from the first film, increasing in sort of tension and stakes, and arguably even more graphic. And it did genuinely have some solid psychological elements and effects to it that I could really appreciate about the film. So yeah, it was better than the first, but I don't see it again being as 4 stars everyone else seems to say it is. Like, it's decent at most, I'd say. Next up, we'll have Venom: The Last Dance. Now, I know what people are going to say about this, because I know some people really hated this, but I honestly did find this to be a fun and decent little send-off to the Venom trilogy, with an actually, in my opinion, emotional last act that actually caught me heart quite a bit and had us a bit emotional. But yeah, what could I say? I just liked it. It was fun enough for us. I think it's kind of a turn your brain off kind of film, that if you turn your brain off, as I said, and you just sit back and enjoy it a little bit, then if you sit back, enjoy it, and don't take it too seriously, I think you'll have a fun time with it like I did. I thought it was well paced and all that, even if there is some stupid stuff. And yes, I agree, the Venom horse looks dense, okay? But yeah, there's not much else to be said about it, really. Landing number 15, we'll have Speak No Evil. Now, the last act of this is definitely what carried this entire film. If it wasn't for the last act, frankly, it would have been about 2 or 2.5 stars and would have been practically near the bottom of the list. It was really good, and honestly, it might be the best just act overall of any film I've watched this year. Not taking into account, obviously, the rest of the film, which is why it's still at this position. But the last act is just honestly what the entire film should have been. Like, I wish those first two were on the scale of that last act rather than being sort of just like a slow burner where nothing really happens during the first 2 acts. Though, again, that last act is really explosive. And yeah, as soon as I walked out the cinema, we both said the same thing, me and Delia, that like that has to be the best act of any film we've watched this year. At number 14, we'll have Sonic the Hedgehog 3. This was my very last film of the year. Honestly, while it suffers still from a few of the franchise's old problems, such as maybe a little bit of cringe dialogue and a few generic story elements that you've all seen before in film, I did think that this has to be, quite frankly, the best entry yet in the franchise, because it does have some half-decent jokes, and I do like Shadow as a villain. The only problem with him, and frankly, this film's biggest problem, if I'm going to be honest, I just wish they gave him so much more screen time than a few bits at the start and a few bits at the end, because he's a really interesting character, and if they just fleshed him out a little bit more, I would have liked it much more, and it probably would have got the 4 stars from us, but sadly they didn't. So going forward, if they're going to focus on interesting characters, I just hope that they develop them more. At number 13, we'll have Alien Romulus. This is a slightly too long first act in the film, and the ending I wasn't a big fan of. I won't spoil it, but it does involve a certain hybrid, and it does, especially visually, look a bit stupid. And I've heard apparently this kind of hybrid has already been explored within, I think it was Alien Prometheus, which I've not watched. The only Alien films I've seen is the first 3 and this one, so I can't really comment on Prometheus or anything like that. But what can I say? It had some really good tension. Honestly, probably even better than Trap, I'd say. It had a lot of good callbacks to the first 2 films, while still feeling like something that could stand alone by itself. It didn't feel overwhelmed by them at any point. And yeah, I still thought it was a decent film and entry in the Alien franchise. And the two guys I went to see it with loved it, even though one of them had already seen it before. He even went to say 4.5 stars for it. So yeah, but yeah, I'd say it's a decent entry in the Alien franchise and honestly worth a watch. If I was to rank them, it would be Alien 3, even though I do still think Alien 3 is alright, it's just the weakest of the bunch for us. Alien Romulus, and then it would probably have to be Aliens in second place, and Alien on the top. I know those top two are often disputed, but that's just my opinion on the matter. So yeah. Now in number 12, before we go on, I'd like to say from this point onwards, I know I've said this speech a few times already, but from this point onwards, we're in 4-star and upward territory. So these are like the best films of the year that we're getting into now. I will admit this one I did contend with maybe dropping it down to a 3.5, but I decided to keep it at a 4 just because of its ending and its overall tone and all that. I just thought it was really well done in that respect. So in number 12, we have One Life. It scraped through 4 stars, as I said, because of its ending, and the ending did genuinely nearly make us cry. And I did see the people around us actually tearing up quite a bit, passing tissues between each other. It was genuinely that much of a pull on your heartstrings. It was really hard to watch. Yeah, it could have been more depth in places, and it does feel a little bit BBC at times. But Anthony Hopkins is a delight as always, including in Rebel Moon. And its story feels really relevant today, especially considering what this film's intertitles end with talking about. And it just feels, yeah, it just feels really relevant. And honestly, this is definitely an important film today. Maybe not as much as American Fiction, but yeah, still important nonetheless. Going up from that, we'll have a long awaited sequel that I was very happy to watch. We have Deadpool and Wolverine. Does it have a weak story? Yes. Did I laugh my ass off? And was I entertained? Also, yes. And yes, you can say whatever you want about the fan service, but I had a really fun time with this, as clearly did the entire cinema screen when I was watching this. Honestly, a really fun film. And yeah, genuinely, I do think it is a really fun send off to the other two Deadpool films. Sure, it's not as good as the first two, and Cable and Russell do kind of vanish for no reason, but I still think it's a solid entry and solid end to the Deadpool trilogy. What can I say? I really like this one. Heretic, I have a very short review for. Hugh Grant is a great villain. Creep by Radiohead is a great song. Enough said. At number 9, we have Your Monster. This is another really niche one that I don't know how many people have seen. And I'm not saying that to be insulting or like a proper film or anything like that. I'm just genuinely saying I don't think many people will have seen this one because of how sort of low the membership viewing is on Letterboxd when I've looked at it. So just to explain what I'd liked and didn't like about this one. It has a few minor plot holes I noticed, as well as a few maybe little small pacing issues, but that didn't stop us enjoying the solid humour here and decent concept it had to offer. That's based on sort of a childhood fear that I honestly actually did really appreciate, and it has quite a nice heartfelt tone to it, while still being kind of a nice horror entry. Yeah, it was just a fun little film, and honestly, even if it's low budget, this is quite frankly low budget filmmaking done well in my opinion. Landing at number 8, we have The Iron Claw. This has a last act that goes on for a bit too long, yeah, which is what dragged it down to the 4 stars for us. It was the same with Tyler, if I remember right. I think he gave it 9 out of 10 from a review earlier this year when I did that one with him. But Zac Efron, honestly, again, it's another actor showing the versatility in a role. I would have never expected to see him in a wrestling role, but honestly, he does really well here. And Kevin Von Erck himself said he loved the film, so honestly, it had to be this high up the list. Honestly, it's a great film, and even if you're not a wrestling fan, I still highly recommend you watch this one. In place number 7, we have Gladiator 2. Now, there is a minor bit of pacing problem around the middle of it, and yes, the CGI animals look a bit stupid, but it was a great sequel to the first, though I did have to read a recap because I just didn't have time to watch the first one before going to watch this. And it extinguished my doubts about how late it was, and with otherwise great pacing, except that chunk around the middle. It has performances from Paul Mescal, Denzel Washington, and Pedro Pascal that are honestly great, and there's some solid storytelling here. And I remember, as Matthew from Blue Web Network says, it has the smell of hard cash wherever you look at it. It doesn't just feel like a cash-in sequel like Golf Joker Folia do. But yeah, it was just a really good film. And yes, you can argue it's unnecessary, but it still feels like a really good film to watch. And there's clear care put in by Ridley Scott to continue this on rather than just making the film a cash grab. Number 6, we'll have yet again, and potentially the most controversial film placing on this entire list, Argylle. Now, yes, I understand the nonsensical nature of this film, and people are probably going to start hitting the dislike button for this, but hear us out. Yes, it's nonsensical, but this has to be one of the most fun films I've seen in a long, long while. I mean that. And its entertainment value here is genuinely unmatched to anything I think I've even seen this decade so far. It was a really pleasant surprise, especially considering the poor reviews going into it. Me and Tyler absolutely love this film, and I will die on this hill. I don't care. Yeah, it was just really fun, and I don't care what you say. I'm gonna die on the hill that I think Argylle's a great film. At number 5, moving on from that, we have Anora. While there is a slightly slow first act, and honestly a bit too slow if I'm going to be completely frank, and it does have sex thrown in, to be blunt, for no real reason during it that I just couldn't really find any relevance for. There is a scene in the second act where just absolutely everything changes, and it had me and the entire screen just absolutely laughing our asses off. It was brilliantly written humour, and honestly, after that, the pacing was completely fine. It was great. The ending, yeah, it does go on maybe a bit too long, but I'd still say it was relatively engaging. And I do think there is an unrealistic choice with the searching later on. Like, it's kind of like, wouldn't the search there is one of the first places that kind of feels like a plot hole. But other than that, yeah, this was a great entry. And yeah, again, if you have a decent sense of humour and you're a fan of Mikey Madison, this is one for you. Number 4, we'll have one practically everyone watching this video will have seen, The Substance, or at least heard about. Easily the most what the fuck, sorry, easily the most WTF film I've seen this year and probably for a long time. I loved it, but probably won't watch it again for a long time, if ever, just because of the last 30 minutes of it, which did let the film down, but it was so graphic, and yeah, it makes us feel queasy thinking back to it. But I do really, really respect what this film has to say about body image for women in particular. It's honestly one of the clearest representations of that subject I think I've ever seen in a film, and it's so well handled by Coralie. I'm not going to say her second name because I know I'll butcher it. But yeah, honestly, a great film and one of the highlights of this year for me. Landing number 3, we have The Wild Robot. This is what Migration was going for, and this is what I was talking about earlier when I said there was a kids' film from this year that really stands apart from the rest of the bunch. My only problem was a first slow half with it that was similar to, because I watched by myself Dead Poet Society earlier this year, and it was basically the same problem I had with that. But honestly, I can really appreciate the message here that they're going for about environmentalism, as well as the decent humour for a kids' film that even had me laughing, and some solid voice acting on top of just how emotional this thing felt. Honestly, can we please make more kids' films like this? This thing was great. Yeah, I can't stop talking about this film. I absolutely loved it. And yeah, bring back these kinds of kids' films, and I hope this is the first of many, because we need more like it. That's all I'm going to say about it. At number 2, we'll have another one of the first entries for films that I watched this year at the cinema, Poor Things. Yes, the opening and arguably as well the first act is a bit slow and confusing and just honestly maybe a little bit even dull, I'd argue. But it does have some really strong themes of feminism here that I can really respect about the film, and an incredible story as well as being really memorable and genuinely it's kind of one of those films where you're like, how does someone come up with this? And yeah, but other than that, it's genuinely a brilliant film, and if you haven't seen it already, I highly recommend you to watch it because honestly you will love it. And Emma Stone, she deserves an Oscar for this film. It was really, really well done. But we are about now to get to the best film of 2024. Now, in first place, we have, drumroll please, Dune Part 2. I'm not even going to look at my laptop screen for this one. This film was brilliant. First act, a bit slow. Sadly, that is the only thing that kept it at 4.5 for me. And I wrestled for so long with giving it 5 stars, but sadly it does have to stop at 4.5. But honestly, if I rewatch this, I can practically say with certainty that it will be 5 stars. When people say this film is as good as Empire Strikes Back, I can see exactly why. Please can we make more epic films to the scale that this thing was. It's an absolutely brilliant film. I'm so glad I got to watch this in the cinema. Tyler still regrets not being able to do so, sadly. But yeah, honestly, a brilliant film, and I highly recommend anyone to go and watch this one. It is genuinely the arguably one of the best sci-fi films I've ever watched in my life, if not the best. I might even say the best sci-fi film I've ever watched in my life. Delia hadn't even watched the first one, and she also gave it 4.5 stars. So it's not even like it's one where you need to have watched the first to just appreciate this. And could we please make films with a Hollywood budget like it used to be, similar to this, once again, please? Thank you. Yeah, that's about all I've got to say about the film. But yeah, genuinely brilliant, practically a masterpiece. And with that, I can thankfully say that 2024 for my film rankings has now been locked. So those are my rankings for 2024. As I said in the Christmas special that released on Christmas Eve, I know I've said this already, but just in case you haven't seen that video, I would like to thank you, as I did last year, once again for this year on Big Dan's channel. It's been great. I know there hasn't been any short films released this year, so I'm sorry if I've let you down in that sense, but trust me, there are at least 2 that I plan on releasing next year. One of which I'm sure everyone will be happy about, that will be getting announced at some point. But honestly, thank you all for this year on Big Dan's channel and in my personal life. It has been a blast. And with that, good night. Thank you.